Hello and welcome to A Mystery and a Mess. I am Amanda, and this weed-covered wasteland is my mess. This is a house we're getting ready to sell. I'm going to clean up the yard. Here at A Mystery and a Mess, I spend time cleaning up a mess, and while I do that, I tell a fascinating story, true crime, wild science, weird history to entertain myself and hopefully you while I clean. So fire up those mirror neurons and let's get started. This week I'm going to try a new format where I'm just going to take a video of what I'm doing, and then I'm going to voice drop the story on top of it afterward. So let me know what you think of the new format. So before we get rolling on this week's crazy true crime story, I wanted to take a minute just to talk about the new format. One of the problems I'm already seeing is that you can see my light and the window reflected in my glasses. So I guess we'll probably be doing most of this video without the glasses. This is the new format that I'm experimenting with. We're going to dive into the case soon, and once I start telling the case, you're going to see the progress on the lawn mowing that I was doing earlier. So let me know what you think of this new format, if it's better or worse, or if you have other suggestions for improvement. And so this week's case is the murder of Dariusz Janiszewski, a gentleman in Poland, and it is another example of egotistical maniacs thinking they're smarter than everyone else and finding out that they're actually stupid idiots. So let's get rolling on the story. Picture it. Wrocław, Poland, November 13th, 2000. A tall, 35-year-old, blue-eyed businessman with long dark hair named Dariusz Janiszewski arrives at the small, successful advertising firm that he owns. His mother, who works for him as a bookkeeper, informed him that a man had called the office at around 9:30 that morning looking for him. The caller had demanded something along the lines of, "Could you make 3 signs, quite big ones, and the third one as big as a billboard?" When she had asked the caller for more information, he had said, "I will not talk to you about this," demanding to speak to Dariusz. She explained that he was out of the office, but she gave the caller Dariusz's cell phone number. He had not identified himself, and Dariusz's mother had not recognized his voice, though she said later that he had sounded professional. Later, when her son showed up at the office, she asked him if the customer had called him, and Dariusz replied that they had arranged to meet that afternoon. A receptionist in the building later saw Dariusz leave the office at around 4 o'clock. He left his car, which was a Puget, in the parking lot, and she noted that as very unusual. Although Dariusz often met with customers away from the office, he habitually took his car. The receptionist would turn out to be the last known person to see Dariusz alive. Nearly 4 weeks later, and 60 miles away, in a remote area in the southwest corner of Poland, where the Oder River curls sharply, creating a tiny inlet, on that cold December day, 3 friends were fishing when one of them noticed something floating near the shore. At first, he thought it was a log, but of course in these cases it's never a log, right? As he drew closer, he saw what looked like hair, and this turned out to be the body of Dariusz Janiszewski. Dariusz's hands and feet were tied to a noose that was around his neck, binding him in sort of a hog-tied or backward cradle position. It would have been an excruciating position, and the sadistic way that he was tied meant that any sort of struggle that with his hands and feet would have caused the noose around his neck to tighten further. So there was no doubt that he had been murdered. He was wearing, or the body was clothed in only a sweatshirt and underwear, and it was very clear that he had been tortured. A pathologist determined that he had virtually no food in his intestines, which indicated that he had been starved for at least 3 days before he was killed. At first, the police thought that he had been strangled before being dumped in the river, but there was fluid in his lungs and signs of drowning, so he was probably still alive when he was dropped in the water, which is just horrifying. It's really a tragic case. I mean, any of the cases that we touch on here that are crimes, they're all tragic and terrible. But this one is just especially sadistic and stupid, as we will come to see. So police initially thought this looked like a gang murder, but that really didn't fit with Dariusz's life. Police questioned dozens of people who knew him and combed through his business records, and they couldn't find a single clue as to why anyone would want to commit a crime against him, let alone such a brutal crime against such a kind person. His acquaintances described him as a gentleman, a particularly gentle man, and an amateur guitarist whose passion was to compose music for his rock band. He, according to his wife, she said he was not the kind of person who would provoke fights. He would never harm anybody. And while Dariusz and his wife had been married for 8 years, they had briefly separated at one point in time. They had had a short period of trouble in their marriage, but since then they had reconciled and their relationship was strong, and they were about to adopt a child. After 6 months, the investigation went cold and was discontinued because of, quote, that's not the quote, because of, quote, an inability to find the perpetrator or perpetrators, as the prosecutor put it in his report. Janiszewski's family hung a cross on an oak tree near where his body was found, and it was one of very few reminders of what the Polish press quite crassly and obnoxiously labeled, quote unquote, the perfect crime. Gross. It looked like, and spoiler alert, they do catch the guy who did this, and I bet he got off so hard to the phrase, the perfect crime. He's just one big walking frickin' ego. Anyway, it looked like there would not be any answers about who committed this horrific crime, or for why Dariusz Janiszewski's loved ones were separated from him. But then, in the fall of 2003, that was all about to change, because Jacek Robleski, a 38-year-old detective in the Wrocław Police Department, unlocked a safe in his office where he stored his files and took out the folder marked Janiszewski. Jacek, which is sort of like Jack in English, and Robel means sparrow, so his colleagues liked to jokingly call him Jack Sparrow, and he was drawn to this cold case. Robleski, it might be Roblewski. I looked up the pronunciation of Dariusz's name, but I think I forgot to look up Roblewski's, so bear with me. Roblewski had heard about Dariusz's murder when it had taken place, but he was really unfamiliar initially with the details when he sat down with the file to look over it at his desk. He knew that in cold cases, the key to solving the crime is generally an overlooked clue that's buried in the original file. He studied the pathologist report and the photographs of the crime scene, and the level of brutality, in his opinion, seemed like the killer had a really deep issue with Dariusz. Moreover, the fact that he was found without his pants on indicated that whoever had killed him wanted to humiliate him. Additionally, whoever had killed him wanted to humiliate him, but there was no evidence of sexual abuse. So initially, according to Dariusz's wife, God, this does not make sense, one sentence to another. Let's try that transition again. He was found naked, well, in just a sweatshirt and underwear. Detectives, and in this particular instance, Wroblewski, felt like that indicated that his killer also wanted to humiliate him, though there were no signs of sexual abuse. And according to his wife, Dariusz always carried credit cards, but they had not been used after the crime, so that was an indication that this wasn't a robbery. I took a lot of this from a couple articles, and I think those articles took a lot of stuff from like each other, and like, duh, it wasn't a robbery. I don't think, anyway. So after poring over this file for several days, Wroblewski's break in the case came when he discovered that Dariusz's cell phone had never been found. He decided to see if the phone could be traced, which was kind of an unlikely possibility. At this time, Poland was lagging behind other European countries in the high-tech development methods, and the police force was pretty financially strapped and was only just beginning to develop more sophisticated methods of tracking cellular and computer communications. But nevertheless, Wroblewski had taken a keen interest in these techniques, and he began an elaborate search with the help of the department's recently hired telecommunications specialist. Although Janiszewski's telephone number had not been used since his disappearance, Wroblewski knew that cell phones have a serial number that from the manufacturer, and so he reached out to Dariusz's wife, and she happened to still have the receipt from the purchase of that cell phone. And so they were able to basically search for this information on the internet, and to everyone's astonishment, he and his colleagues soon found a match. A cell phone with that same serial number had been sold on a website called Allegro, which is an internet auction site, likened in most articles to sort of a Polish version of eBay. So the cell phone had been sold on this website 4 days after Janiszewski's disappearance. And the seller had logged into the website using the username ChrisB7. So that's CHRIS, the American spelling of Chris, short for Christopher, the letter B, and the number 7. Investigators quickly learned that this Chris B7 was a 30-year-old Polish man named Krystian Bala. Now, his name is spelled in the Polish style, Krystin, Krystian Bala. And it becomes increasingly important over the course of the story that he goes by sort of these two names, Krystian with the K, the Polish spelling, and Chris with the CH, the American spelling. English spelling. So Krystian Bala had since moved out of Poland since that sale took place, and he couldn't be easily reached, but has Wroblewski sort of checked into Krystian Bala's background. He discovered that he had recently published a novel, and this novel was called Amok.
Amok! Amok, 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 amok! Oh, we're just one child.
Amok, amok, amok. I could not resist the wonderful Hocus Pocus gif. I mean, I can't resist most Hocus Pocus related stuff, but this is Amok, spelled A-M-O-K, which means, God, why can't I remember what it means in Polish? Why did I not write it down? It doesn't mean amok in Polish, but it means something similar, chaos or destruction or some other sort of negative, terrible term. Ugh. So, here's the note in my script. This is at this point in writing the script, I got so fed up with this dude. I have not gotten into too much detail yet, but I have, of course, read like all the research materials, and this is actually the second time I wrote this script, because about a year ago I made this whole episode. I recorded it, I wrote the script, I did all the research, and my computer died and ate all the videos and the script before I could edit them and post it. And so, I don't know, maybe this is a plug for like the cloud and backing up your stuff, or for like not being so poor that you can't get your computer fixed. Anyway, that was the beginning of a period where recording became more and more difficult for both like reality reasons and for health reasons. So if anyone's interested in the journey of how I came to realize that I am a person with a disability and fights with my doctors and my health is slowly deteriorating and starting to destroy my life, you know, let me know in the comments and I can make a video about that. But I get the feeling that people who come to see these videos are not really that interested in my personal freaking ridiculousness. So back to the story. Detective Wroblewski read this book that Krystian Bala had published, and it was bad. Not just like poorly written and crappy, but it was also disgusting and sadistic and pornographic. It was really horrifyingly self-masturbatory philosophy bro garbage. But beyond just being like gross drivel, it also included a graphic description of a murder that was conducted in a chillingly similar manner to the murder of Dariusz Janiszewski. And it was committed by a killer named Chris, the CH spelling, that name that Krystian Bala, with the K spelling, the author, liked to use as his online username. And that is where I left off. So let me finish writing the frickin' script. So Detective Wroblewski read the book that Krystian Bala had written, and it was bad. It was disgustingly sadistic and pornographic, and it was, I've already said all this, so we'll skip ahead to... Wroblewski printed out chapters of the book and gave them to other detectives to search for clues that might tie the graphic narrative to Dariusz's murder or to Krystian Bala's life. They tried to find clues or coded messages or really any parallels with reality. Because Krystian Bala was living outside the country at the time, Wroblewski warned his colleagues that they shouldn't do anything that might alarm the author. They didn't want to scare him off and prevent him from returning to Poland. Because he would periodically return home to visit his family, and that would be the best time, the best opportunity for Polish authorities to apprehend him. So for the moment, the police needed to refrain from questioning his family and friends, and instead the team focused on combing through public records and comparing them with a profile of the character Chris from the novel. Wroblewski kind of kept this scorecard comparing Krystian and Chris. It was came down to both of them were obsessed with philosophy and both of them had driven their wives away. They both were terrible businessmen who had to go bankrupt because of their businesses. Both of them traveled around the world, and both of them drank heavily. Wroblewski also discovered that Krystian Bala had once been detained by the police, and when he got the report on that, he felt like he had already read it, because it was identical to something that happened with the character Chris in the book. Krystian Bala's friend would later testify in court that they had been out drinking, they had drank until dawn, and when the alcohol ran out, they went to the store, and he said, then we had a very stupid idea. We went into the church and we saw Saint Anthony's figure and we took it, which was identical to a crime committed by Chris, the character of Chris in the book. Another incredibly telling parallel in the novel is when, after the murder in the book, Chris says, I sell the Japanese knife on an internet auction. And this was the same internet auction site where Krystian had sold Dariusz's phone. The similarity to the sale of the cell phone, a detail that police had never released to the press, was really too extraordinary to be coincidence. An ex-girlfriend of Krystian Bala's would later say that she was shocked by the book. She said, he never used those words. He never acted obscenely or vulgar toward me. Our sex life was normal. And it must have kind of burned up Mr. Deep Dark Philosophy Bro to have his, boring vanilla sex life called out like that. When Wroblewski and the telecommunications expert checked to see if Krystian Bala had purchased or sold any other items on that internet auction site as Chris B7, they came across another interesting discovery. In October of the year 2000, about a month before Dariusz was kidnapped, Krystian had clicked on the sale of a police manual that was called Accidental Suicidal or Criminal Hanging. It went into various ways that a noose might be tied, and it didn't look like Krystian had actually managed to purchase the book, but it was unclear whether he may have been able to obtain it elsewhere. And either way, it did make it clear that he was seeking information about this manner of killing, and to Wroblewski it seemed like a sign of premeditation. Then, finally, in the fall of 2005, Wroblewski found out that Krystian Bala was returning to Poland, and on September 5th of that year, he was arrested. Krystian went on to claim that he had been subjected to severe police brutality, that he had been choked, beaten, threatened, and nearly forced to dig his own grave. Wroblewski insists that none of this is at all true, and given Krystian's penchant for sort of melodramatic self-glorification, we'll just say that it was investigated and no evidence to support Krystian's claims was ever produced. According to Wroblewski and the other officers, they apprehended Krystian Bala near a drugstore without any violence and drove him to the police headquarters with no issue. During the period that he was initially held, Krystian Bala was given a polygraph test and delivered a presentation on why polygraphs are not good science. He engaged in breathing exercises like those he used as a scuba diving coach while he was overseas. And the polygraph examiner felt that he was attempting to manipulate the polygraph results. Unfortunately, the polygraph was ultimately inconclusive. I shouldn't say unfortunately, I mean, it's not really admissible either way, but in Poland, after a suspect is detained for 48 hours, the prosecutor has to either present evidence to a judge and charge the suspect or, release him. The case against Krystian Bala for the murder was really weak and too weak to bring charges at that point. All Wróblewski and the police had at that point really was the cell phone and the book. And Krystian Bala was claiming that he had obtained the cell phone from a pawn shop. There was no motive and no confession. What they ended up doing was charging Krystian with selling stolen property, Dariusz's cell phone, and with paying a bribe in an unrelated business matter that they had uncovered during their investigation. Neither crime was likely to hold a significant jail sentence, but it would at least make it so that Krystian had to turn over his passport and couldn't leave the country. Wróblewski said during an interview that at this point he had spent 2 years working to build a case and he felt like he was watching it all collapse. But since Krystian Bala had to turn over his passport at this point, Wróblewski found himself flipping through it and noticing stamps from Japan, South Korea, and the US. And it sort of tickled a thought, a memory in his brain that when Poland's television equivalent of like Crime Watch or had aired details of Dariusz's murder in an attempt to generate fresh leads back when it had initially happened, the website had received messages from various places in the Far East and other places that came up in Krystian's passport because Krystian was a keen scuba diver, and it was discovered that he had actually been visiting all of those places at the times that those messages had come in. The television show 997 was not accustomed to receiving visits from outside of Poland. It was generally a pretty local niche show. And so Wróblewski found that the dates of the messages and the locations matched with Krystian Bala's passport, so that was one more piece of information. With Bala unable to leave Poland, Wróblewski and his team were then able to question Krystian's close friends and family. And while many of Krystian Bala's friends spoke highly of him, eventually a kind of dark picture started to emerge, particularly around 1999 and 2000, when his business was going bankrupt because he was a terrible businessman, and his marriage was collapsing because he was an abusive jerk. And when Dariusz was murdered, it had been an especially troubled time in Krystian's life. A friend recalled that Krystian at this time had, quote, started to behave vulgarly and wanted to take his clothes off and show off his manliness, which is really unpleasant. And the family babysitter said that he was increasingly drunk and out of control, and that he constantly berated his wife Stacia, shouting at her that she slept around and she cheated on him. He had been married to Stacia for a very long time. They had been high school sweethearts, and honestly, when he had married her, his mother, Krystian Bala's mother, thought that the pairing was below him because he was an academic and Stacia was a high school dropout who worked as a receptionist. Turns out his mother kind of had it backward there. One of them was certainly better than the other one, but it was Stacia who was the reacher. Or not the reacher, it was Stacia who was settling in that case. So according to several other people, after Stacia left Krystian Bala in 2000, he remained really possessive of her. He was sort of according to one friend, quote, an authoritarian type. He constantly checked her phones and monitored her. He was really controlling. There was a New Year's Eve party in the year 2000, which was just a few weeks after Dariusz's body had been found. And at that New Year's Eve party, Krystian Bala thought that a bartender was making advances at Stacia, and one of the witnesses said he went crazy. He screamed that he would take care of the bartender and that he had already dealt with such a guy. And at the time, Stacia and her friends had sort of dismissed his drunken outburst. I get the impression that wasn't exactly out of character for him. Even so, it took 5 people to restrain him, and one of them literally said to police that he was running amok. So in addition to questioning his friends and family, the squad also increased their efforts to trace the 2 phone calls that had been made to Dariusz's office and to his cell phone on the day that he had disappeared. The calls had come from a public telephone, but both calls were made with a calling card, and each card is embedded with a number registered to a phone company. Basically, the telecommunications expert on this case was able to determine that the number on the caller's card, or they were able to figure out what that number was on the caller's card, and then the police were able to use that information to trace all the telephone numbers that had been dialed with that same card. And over a 3-month period, 32 calls had been made from that phone card, including calls to Christian's parents, to his girlfriend, to his friends, and to a business associate, in addition to those calls to Dariusz's office. Robleski and his team also uncovered another connection between the victim, Dariusz, and Krystian Bala, the suspect. A friend of Stasia's told police that in the summer of the year 2000, when she had gone with Stacia to a nightclub called the Crazy Horse, which is really funny to me because there are so many bars called the Crazy Horse and they come up in all these different cases. And in college, I used to cocktail waitress at a bar called the Crazy Horse, which is sadly not around anymore, but weird coincidences. Anyway, Stacia's friend was with her at this club called the Crazy Horse in Wrocław, and while they were dancing, she saw Stacia talking to a man with long dark hair and bright blue eyes, and she recognized him from around town as Dariusz. This friend had established a connection, or a possible connection, between Dariusz and Krystian Bala, was that the friend had seen Stacia talking to a person that the friend recognized as Dariusz. So this was basically the last person that Robleski needed to question was Krystian Bala's ex-wife. To this point, she had refused consistently to cooperate. It's hard to say whether she believed his claim that he was being unfairly persecuted by police, or more likely that she was terrified of her ex-husband. But either way, she had at that point refused to give them any information to help the investigation. But Robleski and other officers approached Stacia one more time, and they had a new tactic, so to speak. They showed her sections of the book Amok, which Krystian Bala had published after they split up, and she had never read it or looked at it closely. And according to the Polish authorities, when Stacia was directed to examine the passages involving Chris's wife, Sonia, she was so disturbed and sickened by the character's similarities to her that she agreed to talk. So Stacia confirmed that she had met Dariusz at the Crazy Horse. She had ordered french fries and asked the guy at the bar next to her basically if the french fries had come up yet, and that guy was Dariusz. They spoke all night long. They ended up really hitting it off, and he gave her his number, and later they went on a date. After the date, things had gone really well again, and they checked into a motel, but before anything happened, Dariusz told her that while he was separated, he was still married, and she left. She said in the interview with police, "Since I know what it's like to be a wife whose husband betrays her, I didn't want to do that to another woman." And the difficulties in Dariusz's marriage soon ended. He and his wife worked things out, and he and Stacia never went out again. Several weeks after her date with Dariusz, Stacia said that Krystian showed up at her house drunk and in an absolute fury, demanding that she admit that she had had an affair with Dariusz. He actually broke down her front door and hit her. He shouted that he had hired a private detective and he knew everything. And he also mentioned that he had visited Dariusz's office and he described it to Stacia. And he said that he knew that they had gone to a motel and even knew what room they had been in. And later, when she found out that Dariusz had disappeared, she asked him if he had anything to do with it, but he told her he didn't. And she didn't pursue the matter, believing that for all of his sort of tumultuous behavior, she didn't think that that Krystian was a murderer. But after that interview, Wróblewski says that he thought for the first time he understood the last line of Krystian Bala's book, which is, "This was one that was killed by blind jealousy." And they finally had everything they needed to move forward with murder charges. The trial of Krystian Bala began on February 22nd of 2005. The judge, Lydia Hojenska, I could be really wrong about the pronunciation of that name, but the judge sat at the head of the courtroom beneath a big white eagle emblem for Poland, and in accordance with Polish law, there's the presiding judge, another judge, and 3 citizens to form the jury. Then at the prosecutor's table, next to the prosecutors, were seated Dariusz's widow and his parents, and his mother held a picture of her son throughout the trial. But the most eye-catching part of the trial to me was the old style like sideshow cage that Krystian sat in during the trial. It was a rectangle of thick metal bars that was like 9 feet tall and 20 feet long, and Krystian Bala looked like some sort of exhibit as he smirked behind the bars while facing up to 25 years in prison. Doesn't that seem like insanely short? 25 years max? I mean, this dude, he kidnapped someone, tortured a human being for at least 3 days, and brutally murdered him, all in the coldest of cold blood, based on some imagined affair with his wife, who had already left him because he was an abusive, egotistical a-hole. And worse, he did it as fodder for his trashy novel. A psychologist testified during the trial that Krystian and Chris, the character in his novel, shared many of the same sadistic tendencies. And in accordance with Polish court procedure, Krystian was actually able to directly question witnesses without having to testify himself, and he took advantage of this to argue semantics with witnesses and nitpick their word choices. His attempts to demonstrate that he was smarter than everyone else Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? Why do you assume you're the smartest in the room? His attempts to prove that he was smarter than everyone else fell more and more flat as the mountain of evidence against him continued to build. Ultimately, he was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Thank goodness. But like immediately afterward, he appealed, and I wasn't able to find very much about his appeal written in English, because most of the reporting on this and the court records and everything are in Polish. But what I do know is that sometime in 2008, his appeal was granted and his original trial was, quote, annulled. I don't know if that's a different specialized court term or just a strange translation, but his original trial was annulled. That said, he was not released from prison. The appeals court retried his case while he was still in prison, and he was once again found guilty and presumably sentenced to continue the 25-year sentence that he had initially received. And that's really friggin' good news, because in addition to all the evidence related to Dariusz's murder that authorities found on his computer, they also found in that computer evidence that Krystian was collecting information on Stasia's new boyfriend, a man named Harry. Krystian had written in his computer, quote, single, 34 years old, his mom died when he was 8. Apparently works at the railroad company, probably as a train driver, but I'm not sure. Robleski and the authorities suspected that Harry might be Krystian's next target. After Krystian learned that Harry visited an internet chat room, Krystian posted to the chat room, posted a message under a different pseudonym and said, I'm sorry to bother you all, but I'm looking for Harry. Does anyone know him from Chojno? I don't know what that last word means. It's Polish. It could be something having to do with a train. It could be a city. I don't know. But long and short of it, like, he was looking for this guy, for Stasia's new boyfriend. And, it just terrifies me. I mean, I've had an ex who hacked into my computer and my phone and everything, who compiled information on the people that I dated, and even just friends of mine. I've had an ex use information like that to threaten and harass my friends and people I dated, and thankfully no one has been murdered, to my knowledge. But there's something very, very sick and dark about a person who views you as just a possession. There's also something really undescribable about never knowing if you're being watched or how far that person will go next. It's just sick. This case is nothing but sick, sadistic ego. So rather than stroking that pathetic ego anymore, I think the most important takeaway from the trial comes from Dariusz's widow. At the trial, she pleaded with the press to stop making Krystian Bala out to be an artist rather than a murderer. Since his arrest, his book had become a bestseller in Poland, selling out virtually every bookstore. How gross is that? Don't do that. People, don't buy the garbage that killers write. There's plenty of stuff out there. Even awful, dirty, vulgar philosophy bro garbage like Amok. There's plenty of that isn't written by actual murderers. Find that, please. Ugh. And if you really want to know, if you really need to know what's in the book, then check out the New Yorker article. So it's way more into Krystian Bala and his writing and the content of the book than I was really comfortable reading, because it seemed a little killer glorifying to me. But if you want to know about what's in the book, that article should give you enough. And honestly, I pulled a lot of information for this episode from that article. So there's going to be a link to it down in the description, along with all my other sources. Sadly, some of my sources are missing because I couldn't remember everything that I originally listened to and read when I first prepped this case. I know that in particular, I listened to a really pleasant podcast that I think was done by 2 art students. And first of all, I don't know if I'm remembering it being art students correctly, but I'm pretty sure I am. But I wasn't able to find it again. And I pulled quite a bit for this episode from my memory of that podcast, although I did double check facts. So that's the case of idiocy run amok and the moron who documented the murder that he committed and published it in a book. I am so very, very happy to be back. So please like the video, subscribe, ring my bell so you can get next week's episode right away. And I'd love to hear from you on the A Mystery and a Mess Facebook page, or that Facebook page also has a Mystery and a Mess group where we chat about true crime, wild science, weird history, and cleaning to our heart's content. Here are today's before and after shots. And let me know in the comments if you like this format or if you prefer the old one. I'll have to figure out something to do with the old one. Part of the reason I switched it up is in the last video where I was cleaning the grime off the door, I actually scrubbed a lot of the finish off the door because I was so distracted by telling this story. But and what are your thoughts on murderers making money off of writing about their crimes? And what are your thoughts on philosophy-driven ego bro dudes? And as always, what content do you want to see in future episodes? Thank you again so much for joining me for this episode of A Mystery and a Mess. And until next time, learn something new and clean up your act.